we have an impressive variety of speakers here that cover quite a wide set of subjects. I would love that each one of you do bring up questions, and allow me to try and take it right to left. The local culture goes that way. So I'll take questions from the right, and then I'll be back, and we'll take a couple of these rounds. We have some time, so guys, we have good time. So I'll probably, would you allow me? I'll start from the right. Yeah, please go ahead.
My name is P. Emilsson. I'm in education, and I note that you have founded a citizen school.
Yes.
And if you go into economic, social issues, education is the key. I have now 30,000 students in 6 countries.
Wow.
And I also have a school in Jeddah, the Noon Academy.
Wow.
And I can see you have a great change in education because private operators are coming in and making sure to provide alternatives, get competition, and get better education. You know, the 2030 program called for about 30% in private education. We are not there yet, so the Kingdom now invites more international operators. I have had interesting meetings with the Minister of Education in UAE also, came to Sweden for 2 days and saw our operations. And I think in everything what we are doing, if we could provide to open up for more of competition education alternatives, that is a ground for social and economic development.
Thank you very much, sir. I totally concur with your statements, and I believe there is an opportunity here in the region to I hate to use the word reimagine, but I think there are educational experiences that are differentiated and probably to some degree more innovative that could come out from this region, since this whole industry, let me call it an industry, is still at its infancy. And thank you very much for your efforts in here in pushing the same agenda into Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia, when it comes to education and the future of that industry there, is going to be massive and is going to be amazing. And with bringing new talents, we would definitely help enhance the quality of people, quality of life, quality of life of many people in the region, and thank you for contributing there. Do you have a question, sir, or would we like to jump to your colleague? Please.
Thank you, Chairman. Nabil Fahmy, former Foreign Minister of Egypt. 3 quick questions. This is an excellent panel. You've been straightforward to the point and made your points very clearly. It's obvious, whether it is Lebanon or Syria, we're going to need a lot of money for reconstruction, infrastructure and otherwise. To Mrs. Dorothée Smith, is the international community ready to contribute to this? Are the finances available? I know everybody will look at the Gulf and say you have to cover the cost. The Gulf, I am sure, will contribute, but I'm really interested in seeing is the rest of the world ready to do this or not. My other question, Chairman, you made a very interesting point about the debate between the private sector and, if you want, the government investments. We have the same debate back home, by the way, between the government leaving more room to the private sector. Are you actually having that debate in Saudi? And if so, is it a constructive debate? My last question to Dr. Abdallah, I know your work in Egypt and I commend you for what you're doing. As you know, 65% of our population is below 30 years of age. And we're a quarter of the Middle East, so most of the Middle East has approximately the same proportion. In terms of food security, especially eating habits, do you see a shift in the habits with age, or that hasn't changed yet?
Last one was in May this year, where the EU pledged to spend like 2 billion, 12 on Syria, but most of it is on Syrian refugees. And I'm afraid the help and the money the EU is going to invest is on humanitarian aid, not on the productive economy. So my bet is that if you want to go back, it could provide return on investment in Syria. So what are the sectors? One is oil, and then you need to re-aggregate the whole territory. The problematic is quite similar to what you have in Iraq, Farid. You can comment on that. You know, oil is part in Basra, part in the Kurdish area. They have to share it, and it's a constant political problem. So you have to provide with institutions that guarantee that the budget is managed in a central way that allows redistribution. Agriculture, I think this will be very difficult to start again because pollution is part of the destruction of the war. Not only the destruction of the infrastructure, but massive pollution as well. One sector that could be very promising for the future, could have been for Syria, was tourism. But you have to realize that like 300 sites, heritage sites, have been touched, partly destroyed by during the fights, by the battles in Syria, plus the looting of the archaeological sites. So there you still have to assess the real impact of the war on that. Because it was an underdeveloped sector that would have been extremely promising in Syria. So I think there you should not think of tourism only in terms of, you know, developing the coast like Assad was trying to do at the end, like super luxury real estate on the littoral. Say that Syria could grow double digits for 10 years because, you know, it's starting from nothing and people are eager, you know, to restart the economy. But my concern is that you have to provide housing for these people. That's the first thing. Like, I'm amazed to see these people who want to go back to Syria where they have nothing. They don't have houses. Some of the houses were destroyed. Some were confiscated by the regime who, you know, passed laws who did allow for confiscation of private property. So everything still is to be done, and so I think the engagement, the commitment of the international community should be political before anything.
Thank you very much. If Annie has a quick add, because we have 3 subjects to cover in here, on the subject of international support for the Syrian situation.
Yes, if I may, the first thing to make sure that we have is security. Without that, you won't get anything. And there's an example to ponder, what happened in Mosul. The destruction of Mosul was far worse than anything you've seen in Syria. Yet, they just finished rebuilding the Leaning Minaret. So this is a success story that could be emulated. Sure. But that required heavy involvement in the international community and also a certain measure of supervision. And I think that's necessary as well.
Any quick thought?
I would also like to add to that I think before you could see real investment, economic investment, either through aid or any other form, I think you need to see very strong reform and stable governments. And I think that would be, for not only Syria, for the wider region, and maybe something we could all discuss later. How do we see that developing in the wider region? Because I think that's really the critical question as well after security.
Yes, I have a question. It's double-fold, actually. It's about financial transparency. If you're going to bring money for reconstruction, how do you ensure that the money gets where it's supposed to go and avoid more corruption? And also, if you want to develop the economics of the region, you're talking about government reform, but don't you need also financial reform and maybe a legal business environment that would be stronger and more conducive for the region as a whole?
You need a legal environment. That's it. Not more conducive. You need a legal environment. You have no environment now.
Yeah, and I agree. So if I may throw in just a quick thought also, I've worked in many countries developing economic zones. So post the need for a proper government and laws and security, I think countries like Syria, if they start with the mindset of starting with where everyone else has ended, when it comes to legislation, and being open-minded about flow of money in and out, I think the public sector can be a huge support. I mean, there is $600 billion sitting disposable income in regional banks. They need opportunities, but then where are the opportunities? They are all held by unfortunate restrictive red lines by many countries in the region. So this is why countries like the UAE and many more countries now regionally are taking advantage of the fact that there are many red lines with many other countries. So probably, I think it's far-fetched, but it's not impossible, I would guess. On the food security.
The question was, do we see changing habits in the Middle East? We have two values in the Middle East that are changing, or they are in opposite direction. One is the definition of beauty. The young people like thinner, healthier-looking singers, actors. I mean, if Kalsoum was back again, she would not even fit on a screen by the young generation. So that's on the plus side. Of course, plastic surgery and operations are doing their part, but people overall are trying to look healthier and more fit. But on the other hand, the challenge we have in the Middle East with the value of generosity. We as Middle Easterns love generosity, and the best way we show generosity and love, like my mother, like my grandmother, like every people who invite us to lunch and dinner, is to keep on telling you, eat more food, and that's something that we need to work on, redefining generosity as something. But on an economic issue, which is more important, problem is whenever I sit with Your Excellency, with the government ministers in Egypt, for them, when I say we need to support local food sufficiency, they tell me, listen, we can buy imported powdered milk or imported raw sugar much cheaper, whether from New Zealand or Brazil. And I tell them, so you are switching between subsidizing the Egyptian farmer to subsidizing the Brazilian farmer or the Australian farmer. Which one you want? Of course, that doesn't make me very popular. But we are trying to get people to understand two things. If you don't support local agriculture, you are supporting someone else's local agriculture. Second point, which is more important, if we add the budget of the Ministry of Health to the budget of agriculture, then you have a great case for having a healthier life, better quality life. Don't spend the money on treating them after they are sick with diabetes. Spend the money in giving them healthy food at a reasonable price, and don't buy a cheap imported dumped food.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'm still adhering to the local traditions. Questions. Yep.
Thank you. So, Tania Sologoup from Crédit Agricole Bank, French bank. So, first of all, Egypt has shown something which is very important for the private sector, which is the question of a lender of last resort. Because even in a very difficult financial situation last year, the fact that the GCC has put money, which was exactly what the market was waiting for, has suddenly erased all the expectations, whatever the legal, and you know that Egypt is still in a very difficult financial situation, but the fact that the coordination for once between all the GCC countries and IMF to bring money in order to bring the premise of lender of last resort was enough to solve something which was very, very difficult. So this is the first point, leading to the question of coordination. And coordination between GCC countries in order to bring liquidity, also in order to engage the pump of financing. And to be frank, this is really a question which is not so clear for us. The ability of all these countries, because on one side we speak about the economic situation of GCC and a huge amount of reserves, even if Saudi situation is not so clear from the point of view of PIF treasury, but still with liquidity, but no coordination in the help about the most fragile countries. And sorry, a second point about food security. This is also a question of a mix of solutions, because of course you have to protect and to produce locally, but if I take Qatar and the milk story with 24,000 cows, very difficult from the point of view of water and so on. Once again, okay, very important to create and to impulse new sectors locally, strategic stocks, but also coordination in imports, because anyway, you will need imports. So if you take the last Qatari food security strategy, which has been produced, I think, 3 days ago, something like that, it's clear that it is also a mixture of solutions based on coordination locally, but also with some external flows. So the question behind is, what about coordination in the region from a financial point of view, strategic vision point of view, and so on? Because you can decline it also between visions, attraction of FDIs, and so on. It seems to me competition derails coordination.
Anyone of you would wish to put on? Yeah, I believe you are the right person.
So before I joined ADCB, I was the chief economist of EFG Hermes. I've looked at Egypt also for over 20 years. I wouldn't say there was much coordination for the Egypt package. It came from Abu Dhabi, the Ras Al Hikmah deal, over 35 billion. I think Egypt had got to a point that the liquidity shortage was so acute that even if they had another IMF package, 5 billion, 10 billion, 12 billion, it would not have made a difference. You've got a situation now that for 4 years you've got the external financing requirements met. We've started to see reforms on the subsidy front, but already you've seen the government saying that they're going to move more towards privatization because it's difficult for the people to deal with it. The infrastructure needs upgrading. Jobs need to be upgraded. The education system needs, investment. And I don't see much coordination from this side. I think we had got to a point where it was a point of economic collapse. And it was the UAE. And I think it's really, going forward, 2 countries increasingly in the Gulf that will have the fiscal means to do that. And that's UAE and Qatar. I think Kuwait also has large reserves, but they have their own problems with the need to change their economy and move on with progress. So I don't really see much coordination within the Gulf. In the case of Saudi Arabia, I think it's very much, sorry to use a Trump term, Saudi first. All their resources are going to be used for Saudi Arabia. Yes, there's a discussion a bit on, a Saudi deal. Again, if we look at the NEOM area, if you look at NEOM at the beginning, it was meant to be this axis of development between Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. But I think they've even come out last week and said all their resources are going to be for domestic development rather than overseas investment. So I think, I don't see much coordination going forward for the wider region on that front.
Could I throw a couple of, probably from a different angle? I hear a lot on the subject of us competing, like, UAE competing with Qatar or Saudi and I've worked in Saudi Arabia developing multiple economic zones, and I worked here in the UAE and Oman and Egypt and a few other locations. I want more competition, frankly speaking, because most of the money in the GCC has classically gone outside of the GCC. UAE has changed direction, and probably Oman to a good degree, a while ago, onto deciding to invest that money in the country itself and develop it. Saudi Arabia, for a change, now has always helped others, but never really invested so much in itself. And that's the case now in the GCC. The more Saudi grows, everybody around it will grow. And that will be a bigger collective economy, despite the fact who owns more percentile-wise. But overall GDP, probably there is a case here for a positive outcome. That's my opinion in that. Would you like to add any point?
About investment in Saudi Arabia, I remember I attended the first FII. I think it was in November 17, and at the very moment where Prince Mohammed, it was not merely on the Aramco assets or the internal budget of Saudi Arabia. He was expecting, he was calling for a massive foreign investment, which has not been achieved till now.
So I'll give you an example, if you'll allow me. I don't know how legit, I would say comparably. In Dubai, Dubai government at the time, Sheikh Mohammed, encouraged the families to invest in tourism and build hotels. And most of these families, at the time, Dubai was not a destination. It's hot and it's humid and it's desert, and why would it become a tourist destination? So he and the government of Dubai invested in what is today used to be called Chicago Beach Hotel. Now it's called Jumeirah Beach Hotel. And post that, and the success of that, then the families realized that, you know what? Yeah, we probably should invest in that. And then the airlines came, and so the one fact is that, and you will see that quite clearly in the GCC now, is that government is leading on the key projects. Much of the struggle, though, later on is that it becomes so good of an income that when you ask them to let go of the industry, like leave or actually list these initiatives to the public, give it to the public, it becomes a bit of a struggle, because the money that comes out of it is so good, they do not want to let go of most of it, you understand me? So, and this was happening in Saudi. I mean, Saudi, I've lived in Saudi for 3 years, and I worked in many of these economic zones. I can't believe what's happening today. I wouldn't have guessed that this would happen in my lifetime, but the change that has happened in only a few years, impressive. I can't recognize the Riyadh anymore. I lived there. I don't know even the roads anymore. The reality of the matter is that the government will lead, and it will be, but everybody will benefit at a point in time. And what we would all wish for is that at a point in time, it does not dominate as to be all governments investing, and that some of that is left for the private sector to leverage off. That's hopefully the case. But do they need to build a NEOM? Do they need to build King Abdallah Economic City? Yes, they do. Yeah, they should. I'm sorry, did you receive a reasonable answer?
What will be, which type of debt it will be? So, you have good debt and bad debt. So I'm not, my deep question behind was to find the link between the rich countries of the region and the fragile countries of the region. And which is a big question also, to know if something will be done, as it has been the case in Egypt, even without coordination, because we speak on one side about all these fragile countries, on the other side of the macroeconomic situation of the GCC, but I just raise the question of the link between.
If I may take a crack at this, at least from the perspective of the countries I worked in. I was the managing director, CEO of Baladna, and I took it public, the company that brought in the cows, and I'm now in Egypt doing commercial. First thing, before countries like Egypt, Syria, or Lebanon ask for investments in, they are working on reforming their public sector, or the part which we call state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises, as was mentioned, some of them maybe started as successful, but they don't pay taxes, maybe they don't pay competitive salaries, and really they are crowding out private sector investment. Although we needed them maybe to start, but as mentioned, we need them to exit at the right time. The second thing in economies where interest rates like Egypt is about 30%, the interest rate. You are effectively, as an economist, you are crowding out also private sector, because it's very hard to get viable businesses that will justify this return. And the third thing is the habits of the region. Historically, we love trade. We are traders, and we made more money in trade and in services, and we skipped somehow agriculture and industry in our economic development. And now getting people to see that agriculture will only make sense if you can put a factory next to every farm that will ensure that the food you get out is going to last more than 3 days, which is the case of sugar beets, They only last 3 days, so you have to put sugar factor, what have you. So you need to have this industrial-driven solutions, of course, along with other things. Back to the investment you mentioned, it was straightforward. Egypt cannot afford but to have stability. 100 million people with an economy failing is a risk to the region and really to the world, because we might, I'm not Egyptian, I'm Lebanese, but we might jump on ships and go the other direction. So if you want to keep us there, and that applies to the issue of Syria. You want us to go back to Syria from Germany and France, where immigration is a problem, and where you have a lot of issues in these countries. Help these Syrians, instead of paying them support in Germany or in France or whatever countries they're in, pay the money up in Syria, not in Lebanon and other places. I hope we answered your question, ma'am.
Probably a quick indirect answer. Before what people refer to the Arab Spring, which is probably more of a winter, I used to work in Libya at the Gaddafi days. I used to work in Egypt, and I used to work in Syria, and I used to work in Turkey in developing economic zones. And all of these countries wanted change to the positive. And all the other countries in the region were very happy to come and support. Problem, you can't support if you don't have political stability. So this unfortunate event that has happened has dragged the region a few decades. And I truly salute the wisdom here in the UAE, and Gargash analogy in his speech was impressive, I have to say. I mean, the wisdom this is why peace is more expensive than war. Trying to bring in a stable region, will the other countries be happy to support? I have no doubt. I've seen it. I'm sorry. So we'll need to jump a bit. I believe we've delayed you quite a while. My apologies.
No, thank you for the opportunity. Gidon Bromberg, coming from the regional organization Economist Middle East, a Palestinian, Jordanian, Israeli joint organization. And I think it very much exemplifies the sentiment of His Excellency Garbash in both action in support of diplomacy and words of moderation. I think I wanted to speak to the words of Mr. Farid, who I thought really highlighted the importance of focusing on the climate crisis as a common threat for the whole region. And as an expert in the issue, at least the Eastern Mediterranean is already experiencing a 2-degree increase in temperatures since the 1950s. So it's way beyond the world average we're all fearful of. And we're expecting an additional 4-degree increase in temperature. And here in the Gulf, it's even worse. And I think that brings together the need to focus on coordination. And my question, I think, will be mostly to that question, how do we advance here coordination? When we look at Europe facing the climate crisis, and they're not a hotspot, they produce a European Green Deal. Where's the Middle East Green Deal? And how can we possibly expect to survive the climate crisis without having a clear plan of coordination, of compromise, both political, economic, and social? And then when we talk again about coordination, I had the opportunity to speak about IMEC and the Peace Triangle edition of IMEC in a panel yesterday. Surely, when we're talking about the rebuilding, we need to transform the interests so that we don't rebuild in the same way, as was said earlier, that has just leads to another round of destruction. So that the rebuilding needs to be done in a transformative way that changes the interests. And if we don't change the interests that deal with the Israeli, Palestinian, Iranian issues, then we don't really change anything. And I think that's the challenge that we have. And I'd love to, I think Europe has done it through, coal and steel, and then the European Union, and it's an example of the European. I'd be grateful to ask, what do panelists see as the greatest challenges to moving forward in the Middle East in similar directions? And please don't, I'd really like the discussion to be in the spirit of Anwar Garbash.
Thank you very much. Would anyone would like to pick it up? I have a small comment on this, but I'm not the matter concerned. So I believe in the challenge is always going to be that the environment is not something that is regional. Yeah? Who produces CO2 historically has leveraged of doing so and gathered a lot of wealth by doing so. And many, unfortunately, are judging the less fortunate countries today, pushing them to be more green when they are economically not stable. I believe it goes back to the same problem, is that we as humans have to act with the environment like birds do. Borders are environmentally are not real. Yeah? And for as long as we believe that we have a shared responsibility of uplifting everybody to a reasonable quality of life, the whole subject on being more environmentally responsible in one area versus the other is going to fall apart. That's my opinion.
May I do something on the coordination part? Because, of course, you mentioned different types of coordination. There is also the coordination of the platforms of education and of science production. And this is a typical coordination that in Europe has been tried at least, and that is, let's say, less evident in the region here. And I think this is very important, the notion that there are some platform issues on which you cannot compete because you don't have the scale. So I just want to mention one, which is basically the development of the AI and the large language models. This is something that if you try to do nation by nation, you won't have the critical mass. This is, I tell also in Europe the same thing. When France or Italy, they try to do their own effort. And there is, anyway, a framework in which there is a common platform has been created in which this type of discussion, when to compete and when to instead collaborate, can be done. So I think that the first step is this one. Coordination in, I was in Riyadh, I went to visit this last month for the list of the Saudi giga projects. And you can imagine why they took me. And they took me because each of these giga projects has a university project attached, and the notion that of the creation of a network of academic institutions. So this is something that can be done country by country, but also, in my opinion, should have a regional perspective, because only with the regional perspective you get the scale. You need the talent, number of people, number of PhDs. You can't achieve it country by country.
Any input here,
Some countries can.
Mr. Farid, any input here? Yeah? Or any of the other panelists? Would you?
I just wanted to say a word to address what Virginie asked about the stability of the legal frame, etc. So I think wars have made the whole of Syria, part of Turkey, also move to the grey zone completely, to informality. Informality and trafficking does thrive in times of war, clearly. This is what we've seen with the drug economy in Syria. Now, thanks to the Israelis who bombed the laboratories, the Captagon production laboratories, you have a chance maybe to eradicate this, but we don't know. But I mean, informality does not necessarily mean mafia or bad economy. Not necessarily. It means that the state is not in control of the economy. So the problem we have here is the model institution that they're going to build, and I think we have to do more research on what was happening in Idlib and how they did manage the small bazaar, small internal economy of Idlib. So that's very interesting, because how do you bring trust through the new institutions to the citizens so that they will be happy in some way to pay taxes because they know they have return in terms of public services. And one thing that the guys that had Tahrir al-Sham have been accounted for in Idlib is that they restored a minimum level of public services. So that's the first challenge, to have the minimum things to ensure everyday life, working, and then, of course, it comes with the big legal framework, whatever. But it's very difficult to go out, I think, from this culture of cronism that's inherited in Syria from the Assad system for like 50 years. So, distribution of the resources through the clientelistic networks, etc. So that's the whole challenge to having this civil state, equalitarian state, inclusive state, etc. It's not only political, it's not only social, it's also economic. It's an economic challenge, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any questions?
Hello, my name is Bastien, a freelance journalist based here in the Gulf. I just wanted to follow up on what Dorothée Schmid said about Syria and about how Turkey was trying or will try to help Syria rebuild itself. I think it's very interesting. We know that Turkey maybe not directly helped Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's takeover of Damascus, but at least it sort of facilitated the takeover. Now does Turkey really have the will, the interest, the power, the money to help Syria rebuild itself? And how would it look like? You were talking about these Turkey-formed, Turkey-trained entrepreneurs moving to Syria. Maybe I heard you wrong. Can you elaborate on this topic? And are we just talking about economy or also military, culture, religion, anything? What's the scale of this help by Turkey in Syria?
So the panel is about economy, and I think by itself it's a very interesting topic for Turkey because, as I said, I think the presence of Syrians has transformed the economy of Turkey, of the southeast of Turkey, because there has been a big afflux of manpower, people who were used informally and who did sustain growth in Turkey, even at difficult times. So this is why I mean informality was, in fact, a blessing for Turkey. It doesn't mean that they treated the Syrians very well, but I mean, at least they managed to have them survive. And part of the manufacturing infrastructures moved to Turkey as well. So, okay, that's because it's a closed country, it's a productive economy, they have 900 kilometers of border, so it was probably a more promising place, to set up an economic activity than, I don't know, Lebanon at the time maybe, or other neighboring countries. Of course, the Turks intend to have some return on investment again on what of the big commitment they had in Syria. My thing is that I think Turkey has been transformed by what they did in Syria. I mean, for the best, for the worst, whatever. I think it even pushed the government to more authoritarianism through security problems, etc. So now they want to reap the benefits of the commitment they had for the opposition. And you know that the stakes for the Turkish building companies and all the industry is very high because they're very good at doing real estate, and so this is what they aim at. They want to rebuild the north of Syria, but this goes, of course, with the political and military project, because the idea is, the opposition in Turkey said we're not going out of Syria as long as the PKK is active, etc. But I think this more than this, that they say they want to protect the Syrian refugees who return to the country. But I mean, they want to have a sort of permanent presence there. I don't know if this is positive, because they protest that they want to protect the Syrian sovereignty, etc. They're acting in complete contradiction. But I think the future of the economy of Syria will have to do with Turkey anyway.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Doc, for the feedback. Do we have more questions going back in this direction, gentlemen? Okay, I believe there was a question in his. I'm sorry? Have you? Any? Okay. You had a question?
My earlier question, but she kind of answered it. But nevertheless, maybe since you're a banker or working in a bank, it would be interesting for me to know if there's a concern in the region about increasing financial transparency, not only to rebuild outside in Syria or Lebanon, but also for yourselves, just to become more adult in the business world with more transparency and legal frameworks.
Yeah. I'm not speaking on behalf of my bank or anything like that. But I think certainly if you look at the wider region, you look at, of course, Egypt has always been a close partner. The potential is huge, but also, again, the need to support the population. I know certainly when I was, before the Arab Spring, when I was at EFG, and there was a lot of focus on the potential development of the wider MENA region. I remember going to places like Syria before the Arab Spring. You could see loads of people from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia. They were doing the rounds. There was a lot of optimism, but I think after the Arab Spring, the many waves of uncertainty, I think that was taken off the radar. So if you look at where GCC banks are investing increasingly outside, it's where the trade corridors are developing, so increasingly areas like Turkey. But what we're seeing is more the CIS countries, countries like Kazakhstan, and these sort of economies as well, that you're seeing more investment going into, maybe even going into places like Africa where there's more corridors, going into places like India where there's increasing economic integration coming in. So unfortunately, countries like Syria and other parts, you're not seeing that discussion coming in. And I think really it's the case of, again, we said the stability, the government, the institutions, the foreign aid donors. I think the banking sector will probably be one of the last areas to come in once you have those areas of institutional stability and signs of multiple years of progress before the banking sector comes in.
Words of context, again, sorry. One thing you have to take into account is that as far as Syria is concerned, the government was under sanctions. Its main economic partners were Russia and Iran, both under sanctions. So what does this politics of external pressure from the West produce if you're interested in increasing transparency? How do you get out of this system of regional system of sanctions?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the feedback in here. Do we have any random questions from anyone in here? Yeah, please.
Hello, Zaina Ashi from Lebanon. I'm in ESG, governance, and manufacturing of F&B. I have concerns about the superpower countries' alignment, about the role of the Gulf in rebuilding the area, and all of these stuff. But don't worry, guys, I'm not going to ask you at the end of this panel about all these issues, since there's a lot of unknowns there. I'm going to address my question to Chairman Adil. You mentioned something about trillions shifting from generation to another in the area. And I guess this is really alarming if it's not done properly. So I want to ask you about the role of corporate governance here and to ensure these kind of succession plannings and conflict resolution within these enterprises, and specifically when it comes to family-owned businesses. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think there's, in fact, a more fundamental question, which is long-term wealth management as basic knowledge. So when I started building a school, I've realized that schools, and I come from the healthcare industry also, schools nor the healthcare industry, the education industry nor the healthcare industry are concerned with our quality of life. And when I say quality of life, are probably segmented into physical well-being, mental well-being, social well-being, and wealth well-being. The education system, for some good reason, 200 years ago, needed to function like a factory. But then you have the question that begs, why is there $600 billion of disposable income sitting in regional banks? Much of that is due to the fact that most of us, I would claim more than 95, 97% of people have no clue on how to long-term manage their wealth, long-term manage their wealth. They all gamble. I put it in my friend's great idea. I put my mother and father's money saving there, and they lose it because 9 out of 10 businesses, either ways, fail within the first 3 years. So by default, actually, businesses fail. That's 200 years of statistics. So delivering on the knowledge of long-term wealth management, delivering on the knowledge of well-being in general, is something that the education sector has to take on board and be responsible of. In fact, it needs to go beyond the education. It needs to be at the government level, because it then propagates into all different structures, government structures, or services that are provided within the government. So long-term wealth management as basic knowledge. Why is physics or chemistry more important than you knowing how to manage your money for the betterment of yourself and future generations? So that is one thing. Second thing, when it comes to governance, I think there is a lot of emphasis, and I'm a PhD in governance of family businesses, and I have a book on that. And I think there's a lot of emphasis on governance. But I think the emphasis has to be, why do we need to stay together at all as a family? Why is it a good idea at all? And with that, we need to appeal to the emotionality of people, that we are all together because it is good for us, it's more efficient. We, as individuals, will have a better chance in life. Our quality of life will raise, vis-a-vis forcing a relationship that is probably better. What's the use of you being rich but hate everyone in the family, or not being able to get your money, or not adding to your quality of life? You're just sitting there cursing your cousin that's running the show. So I think what needs to come ahead of, wealth management, long-term, the science of it, science is there, education is not there. And then emotionality, it needs to be democratic, it needs to be consensus. And then governance come to play. Now, when governance come to play, where it hits a lot, and where a lot of coordination has to happen, and unfortunately governments have to interfere, is with the laws and regulations as well, inclusive of taxation. So I'll give you an example here in the UAE. The government has done a great job in focusing on the area, put in a lot of structures. I have built a family office, 2 family offices actually. I transferred some assets, like real estate assets, to one of the families, thinking this is for the sustainability of the business. But then taxation came, which was the good old days where we didn't understand taxes. I miss those days. So it comes to be that, if a property is under a company, it is taxed. But if it is under an individual name, it's not. So I want to send the property back to the family members. So here where governance come to play in relations to the family. Again, governance is only a translation of what I hope to be an amicable understanding amongst family businesses on how do they foresee the quality of life of future generations. Okay, so that's the way I translate. I don't know if I answered your question. Any other comments, questions? Anybody wanted to throw in a comment in here?
A question on family businesses. So I happen to have known...
Is he okay? Probably another 15 minutes. Please.
Simple question. So growing up, I met some children from merchant families. And they all had a common educational profile. Their parents sent them to private schools en masse. That was in the 70s, 80s. Is this still going on? So I knew children of merchant families from the Gulf, not only from the Gulf, from other parts of the Arab world. Many of them were sent to study in foreign private schools. Is this still an ongoing practice?
Something funny about the education system is that the biggest, like if you bring in a new concept, like for example, I build a school that's focused on entrepreneurship, yeah? And you need to do that because, as I said, 40% of nursery-aged kids will have to be self-feeding. But what the education system produces, and that was due to something that happened in 1796. What happened in 1796? There was the invention of vaccination. So as humans, as a species, it took us 300,000 to 500,000 years to get to 1 billion. And when was that? In the year 1800. Only 225 years ago. So 500,000 years, 1 billion. Vaccination gets invented, 1800. And then there's a huge influx of human population. Governments panicked. They needed to produce a lot of roads and hospitals and schools. And with that, they created an education system that produces disciplined individuals that don't make mistakes. Okay? Yeah. But then in business, it's never an individual, it's always a team. 9 out of 10 businesses fail within the first 3 years. You cannot not make mistakes. Yeah? And it's chaos. There's no discipline in there. Yeah? So in order for us as humans to elevate and actually be ready for I don't call it it is a gloomy future because, look, we've been 200 years growing like crazy as a population. By 2080, we'll stop. By 2080, we might stagnate at around 10.5, maybe 2 billion people, of which 25% of them are above 65 years old. Today is 10%. Yeah? Meaning 1/4 of the population does not spend money, does not produce economical input. How would the stock market react to that reality? Today you have stock markets PE ratios, 20 times and 30 times because they think that we continue to grow as a population, as a species. But if we start decaying today, do you have a clue of today's China's population? It's 1.41 billion. Do you have a clue on how much would it be in the year 2100? Most of the studies. Do you have a lot of them say 760, half. So is real estate gold? Is gold gold? Okay. How would you invest in real estate in China moving forward in mass? I mean, I'm not talking about some pockets. So the question is, how would you ready a whole generation for that kind of a very different reality than the one we lived in the 200 years, which I call an anomaly. We are the luckiest generation that has ever existed in this species, in my opinion. Yes, and we have lived a beautiful anomaly for the last 200 years. That will not last. What a great conclusion to our workshop.
But can I add to that? Maybe this more, absolutely population is declining, but the level of, I fully understand that this maybe doesn't go with a banker's persona, but if you look at the degree of consumption that's ballooned really since the 1980s, and the sort of capitalism on steroids, and the crises we're having on all sorts of environmental areas, maybe we've come to the point where we have to redefine capitalism from where we are now.
And I totally agree. I can't imagine how the world looks like once we start. I can't imagine how this works. Will there need to be a stock market at all? That's a good question. I'm sorry. I think we now let go of the guards and have a light discussion about any points you want, guys. I think we can do another probably. Yeah? Yeah? Did they? Okay. Apparently time is sorry. We had a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much for giving us the platform to have a lot of knowledge. Thank you very much. I appreciate the input of all the panelists. It was an amazing, it is an amazing panel. And thank you very much for giving us your ears and your comments. Thank you.